It's the 21st of July 2020 and football is back from its break. Pubs are kinda open and Nottingham Forest have a 4-goal and 3-point lead over Steve Cooper's Swansea City. There's just a single game left and their opponent is 16th place Stoke City, who have only won 4 of their last 10 games. Everything is set up perfectly for Sabri Lamouchi and his tricky trees to make their first playoff appearance in 10 years. But before we can talk about how the season ends, we need to talk about what happened before. Forest had started the season on fire. After a disaster clash from Muric in goal on the first day, Samba would join and Forest would go unbeaten for the next 10 games. The football was outstanding. Sabri Lamouchi's team had scored this goal against Fulham, where every single player would touch the ball and it would end up in the back of the net. They were always in or around the playoffs all the way through the season. They'd have a poor December, but picked up again in January after Lolly's deflected volley found the net in a game against Brentford. After the full-time whistle, the Reds moved to just 2 points from the automatic promotion places. 2 games later, a late Tyler Walker goal against Leeds capped one of the best performances of the season, and that game had an atmosphere that literally cannot be described. I still get goosebumps thinking about this match, the Lolly challenge, the cutback to Walker, the celebrations with the fans on the pitch. There really hasn't been a game at Forest with that much electricity in the air ever since. There was so much excitement, so much hype around Forest, and Sabri Lamouchi's counter-attacking football was the thing to thank. But while his tactics were spot on, his team selections usually weren't. Just before the first lockdown, Forest would play Charlton and Millwall, 2 poor teams at the bottom end of the table, and they rotated their squads. Lyle Taylor would condemn the Reds to a rare loss after a 24th minute goal, and 5 games later in the Millwall match, Matt Smith would score a 13-minute hat-trick, and then the world would totally shut down. This was the worst time to go on a run like this, because with football and the entire world shut down until June, the fans, the players, the staff and the board only had one thing to think about. Surely Forest weren't going to choke a playoff position, right? After the Leeds game back on game week 31, Forest were 4th, 1 point off 2nd, and by game week 37, when football ended, they'd dropped down to 5th, 10 points off 2nd. Well, Forest came back firing. They drew with a mid-table Sheffield Wednesday, smashed Huddersfield, and squeezed by Bristol City, thanks to this Thiago Silva goal. The automatic spots were out of reach at this point, but Forest just needed 2 wins from their last 5 matches to secure the playoffs. And next up was big rivals Derby County. I bet most people watching this know how this match went. Forest were cruising, absolutely on top, and then in the 90th minute, Joe Worrell gives away a silly free kick. Derby score thanks to Chris Martin. Someone had already celebrated the Forest win by jumping in Nottingham Canal, and that was only a draw. Forest still needed 2 wins. 3rd place Fulham were next. Forest lost. A draw with Preston, and then Steve Cooper's Swansea City would follow, but that meant that just a single draw meant Forest were certain to qualify. They needed a single point, and next up was relegation fodder Barnsley. Surely this game would be at least a draw, right? Well, Forest were drawing until the 91st minute. Patrick Schmidt would score a late goal, and that meant Forest still needed a single point from their last match to confirm a spot in the Sky Bet Championship playoffs. So 1 game was left, and that was against Stoke City, who had nothing to play for. But beyond the table, there were already some warning signs that this was a tougher game than it looked. Stoke had the 2nd longest final day unbeaten run out of any team in England. In fact, only Arsenal had gone longer than their 9 games unbeaten. Forest had beaten Stoke earlier in the season, but had not done the double over them since 1981, when Forest was still reigning champions of Europe. Cardiff, Nottingham Forest and Swansea began that night stacked together in 5th, 6th and 7th. They all had very similar points totals and very similar goal difference. Forest had the best goal difference at +11, Cardiff sat behind on +7, and Swansea lurked 3 points further back on +6. On paper, you would imagine it would probably end in the same order, but of course, football is not played on paper. For Forest, a loss was totally fine, unless Cardiff didn't also lose. Even then, as long as it wasn't by more than 3, and Swansea didn't also win by more than 3, that meant Forest were in the playoffs. The bookmakers were confident. 66-1 were the odds you could get on Forest to miss out on the playoffs, but no matter what happened, history was about to be made. While Sabri Lamouchi's side didn't score too many goals that year, he was just 90 minutes away from being the first Forest manager in 10 years to complete a full season. That last manager was Billy Davies, someone who was the master at reaching the playoffs. So after a week of build-up, previews and excitement to see Forest finally secure another spot in the playoffs, it was time for kickoff. The City ground, of course, was empty. Thousands of fans were paying £5 to watch this match online instead. Mull of Kintyre was sung in 50,000 living rooms, and at exactly 3 PM, all 3 matches kicked off at the same time. Stoke would actually make the brighter start at the City ground, but it was surprisingly open from what is normally a solid Forest defence. The first shockwave came in Berkshire. About 17 minutes in, Rhian Brewster would slam Swansea ahead at Reading, and that single strike lifted Swansea from 67 to 70 points. It also nudged their goal difference to +7. So the three-way picture was closer than ever. We had Forest on 71, Cardiff on 71, and Swansea on 70. Forest still held on to 5th thanks to their better goal difference. The Forest game was next to trigger table movement. Danny Bart's 19th minute header put Stoke 1-0 up at the City ground, and that shaved Forest goal difference down to +10 and also moved Forest to be level on points with Swansea. But even then, they still had 3 better goal difference than Swansea, so 6th place was pretty comfortable. Cardiff's night began after 20 minutes. Junior Hoylett's finish put them 1-0 up at home and bumped them up to 73 points. Those crazy 3 minutes had goals in every match and vaulted Cardiff up to 5th, pulled Forest down to 6th, and Swansea remained in 7th. Cardiff's grip on the playoffs tightened in the 34th minute when Sean Morrison rose and made it 2-0. Cardiff's goal difference climbed to +9, almost equaling Forest +10, but back in Berkshire, Reading, the hosts, would equalise with a penalty from George Puskas. Even with Forest losing, the gap grew back to 2 points, which Forest would absolutely take. Cardiff out in front with 73, Forest stranded on 70, and Swansea sliding behind on 68. Just 1 minute later, over in Nottingham, Forest had a golden chance to level the score there too. A long ball over the top saw Lolly clean through on goal, but rather than shooting himself, he tried to square it to Graben, and Martins Indy was able to get back and clear the danger. But that was all of the action until half-time in each of the 3 games. I hope you don't mind if I take a few seconds to ask you if you want to consider becoming a channel member. If you're enjoying these throwbacks to Forest history, you might acknowledge they take a lot of time to make, edit and research. I would really appreciate if you could press the join button below this video, even if it only covers a single pre-match cob before a home game every month. But thank you so much, and back to the video. I'm not sure why, but Forest's second half was delayed by a few minutes compared to the Cardiff and Swansea games. I don't know if this was planned or just a convenient mistake, but that meant Forest would know the Swansea final score about 5 minutes before the end of their game. And Forest had already come out looking good. In the 61st minute, Lolly would whip a right wing corner into the Stoke 6-yard box where Figueiredo had been left all alone. His header would go in, and that was parity for the Reds. This would push Forest back up to 71 and restore the goal difference to +11. And while they sat below Cardiff, this goal gave Forest some air between themselves and Swansea. With just 30 minutes to go, the Forest-Swansea gap was 3 points and 5 goal difference. But not for long, because 6 minutes later, Wayne Routledge would finish off a sweeping Swansea move, lifting them to a 2-1 lead and back to 70 points with 7 goal difference. Sure, Forest sat 1 point ahead, and that 4 goal difference was surely too big to overcome. It wasn't the nervous 90s for Forest though, it was the scary 70s. James McLean would score in the 73rd minute, and that knocked Forest back down level with Swansea, and the goal difference slipped to +10. They were still marginally ahead of Swansea, but it was shrinking fast. And then Lee Gregory would score in the 78th minute to make it 3-1 to Stoke, and Forest's cushion thinned to just 2 goals. The certainty had evaporated in just 70 minutes. Over in the Cardiff game, they applied the finishing touches and on the 83rd minute made it 3-0. That saw them seal 5th place in everything but mathematics. Swansea, meanwhile, was smelling blood. They needed 2 goals against an abject Reading side. Liam Cullen's 84th minute strike happened 1 minute after Forest conceded their 3rd goal. That meant their goal difference was now +8. They were level on points with Forest, but Forest had 9 goal difference. The gap was just a single goal. I can only imagine what the tension would have been like if fans were allowed in the City ground. I'm pretty sure Sabri and his management team knew about the Swansea score, But then deep into stoppage time, Routledge would strike again. That made it 4-1 to Swansea, lifting their goal difference also to be +9 and matching Forest precisely. Both teams were now on 70 points. Both were on +9 goal difference. They were level in everything that mattered. But Swansea had scored 62, 4 more goals than Forest, which was the 3rd level of tiebreaker. Forest had just fallen out of the playoffs. And as the Swansea game was finally over, it was still the 91st minute on Trent's side. The Reds had to score. A 3-2 loss was good enough for the playoffs, even if they'd be going into the playoffs with 0 wins in 6 games. Forest would flood forwards. Centre-backs Worrell and Figueiredo would join Lewis Grabban in the box, and cross after cross was coming in from both flanks. But then, the moment that summed up Forest's run from February onwards happened. Forest was so attacking that they had no defenders left behind. A substitute striker, Nuno da Costa, had no choice but to put the ball in his own net. Stoke would have scored anyway, and that turned Forest's defeat into a 4-1 collapse and dragged their goal difference down to +8. The own goal didn't really change the picture overall, but after months of being in control, Forest had dropped out in the last 5 minutes. As Forest players were crying on the pitch and Swansea players were celebrating, the numbers looked like this. Cardiff on 73, Swansea on 70, Forest on 70 in 7th. Sabri would reluctantly meet the media after the game, but I'm sure he didn't think he would be Forest manager for much longer. He would have a meeting with Evangelos Marinakis, and as everyone was expecting him to be fired, he was offered a new contract. Sabri was loved by the majority of Forest fans at the time, despite the collapse, but this contract was greeted with mixed views. Was this contract just going to delay his inevitable departure? Well, we all know the answer to that is yes. But it wasn't just the staff that was hit too hard. The loss was so devastating that Sabri Lamouchi focused on replacing already good players with other players just because they wouldn't have the mental block that came from that Stoke match. Lolly, Grabban, Watson, Figueiredo, Samba, Sao all stayed at Forest for a few more years, but never looked like they got over that defeat. Deep down, a part of me wishes that Joe Lolly had scored his semi-final penalty against Sheffield United and that he was the man who would take Forest to Wembley, but even that just wasn't meant to be. But anyway, that's the story about how a team choked a 3-point and 4-goal difference lead in the space of just 29 minutes. Thank you for watching. Please do subscribe if you're interested in more Forest lore and history, but if not, thank you. Just like the video if you enjoyed it, or leave a comment if you want me to read what you've got to say. Thank you for watching anyway. Hopefully this didn't bring back too many bad memories, and hopefully the ones of the recent seasons have kind of replaced these ones. Cheers, and goodbye.